Welcome to our America's Vote special coverage of the CNN presidential debate here at The Hill. I'm Julia Manchester. It's been a monumental lead up to this moment, and in less than 30 minutes, President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump will take the stage for the CNN presidential debate. It all started with a social media post by President Biden last month challenging Trump to 2 debates. And after months of jabs by both candidates, America is preparing to see the presidential hopefuls battle it out on issues ranging from the economy to foreign policy to border security. But what will certainly be a major topic is former President Trump's felony conviction. My team on our weekly talk show, What's America Thinking, hit the streets to talk to voters across the country about what they're hoping to hear and not hear tonight. Take a look.
The bickering, the going back and forth, the slandering and the name calling, that doesn't help anybody.
I have a little bit of dignity about yourself and show some respect, whether you disagree or not.
Bluffs and people playing it safe. I feel like the election is this year, so say what you gotta say.
I would like to see respectful discourse, of course, between Biden and Trump. Fortunately, probably that won't be happening.
I can't be disappointed anymore. It's been a crazy 8 years.
We count major with the vote. We can go to the red side or we can go to the blue side. So they need to get themselves together if you plan on having our vote.
And joining me now is The Hill's congressional reporter, Michael Schnell. Michael, thank you so much for joining me here tonight. Several months ago, I don't think either of us really would have expected to be here. Just to top us off, what are you looking for tonight?
No, remember back in 2020, it was the debate where it turned out former President Trump had COVID on stage. That was sort of, that's the context for these debates that are now happening now. But look, somehow the forces of political nature have gotten us to this point where tonight is the first debate in the 2024 presidential race. I'll note, it's coming pretty early, right? Both Biden and Trump aren't even officially their party's nominees. Those nominating conventions for Republicans not coming until July, for Democrats not coming till August. But look, this is going to give voters a lot of time to take what they see tonight and think about who they want to vote for come November. So I think that a lot of folks are pretty surprised to see that we've gotten to this point. But look, there are going to be a lot of things people are looking out for. And I think that the main thing we're going to see is both Biden and Trump try to land various attacks on one another. If we start at President Biden's camp, expect to hear a lot about abortion. We've known that women's reproductive rights is the main motivator, the large motivator, if not the main motivator, for Democratic voters across the country. Back in 2022, that was the issue that propelled Democrats to have a better than expected outcome. It blunted that expected red wave that never came to fruition. It's been a big motivator for Democrats. Expect the former the President Biden to say that he is going to be in office and wants another 4 years to protect the woman's right to choose. Another thing we're probably going to hear a lot about for President Trump's felony conviction. Look, it was less than a month ago where that 12-person jury in Manhattan found former President Trump guilty on 34 counts of falsifying business records in relation to that $130,000 hush money payment made out to Stormy Daniels. That's a conviction, and there are still 3 other indictments that are making their way through the legal process. I think it's fair to expect that we're going to hear President Biden talk about that and try to put some attention on that. And another thing I think we're going to hear about is just the state of democracy. We've heard President Biden say it time and time again that he's concerned about what the state of democracy will look like if former President Trump is elected to another 4 years in office. I think we're going to hear that message tonight. Now, on the other side of the aisle, former President Trump is going to be trying to land his fair share of attacks on the current president. Expect to hear a lot about things like inflation and the economy. We've seen inflation and immigration. We've seen poll after poll show that voters are really concerned about A, immigration, and B, inflation. And now, in a fact that's playing into Republicans' hands, those are also 2 issues that are very big vulnerabilities for President Biden. You follow this as well as I do. Right. President Biden has sort of struggled to resonate with voters on those 2 issues. They're things that the former president and Republicans have honed in on. Expect to hear more of that. And also, as has been a clear things throughout this entire election. Expect to hear attacks on President Biden's mental acuity and his fitness for office. It's something we've heard from the former president and from Republicans. I expect that we will continue to hear those attacks tonight.
Yeah, worth noting that President Biden is 81 years old, Donald Trump is 78 years old.
Not that far away from each other.
Yeah, two elderly men debating each other on a presidential debate stage at 9 p.m. So we'll be watching out for that. You mentioned timing of this. It's coming early. Neither of these men have officially been nominated for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And Democrats say, look, they were pushing for this early date because of early voting and mail-in voting. We know that that's something that has certainly, I guess, benefited Democrats in the past. But it's interesting because despite, election denialism and some of the conspiracy theories you see on the far right, Republicans are still very much trying to invest more into mail-in voting, into early voting, and encouraging their voters to get out there early. So does this early start time or early start date favor one party over the other?
I'm trying to figure out if it favors anybody because look, I think that this is not a double-edged sword, but there are two sides to the coin here. A, you could think that by having this debate early, we're in the month of June right now, debate's not until November, it gives voters a lot of time to watch what they heard tonight, digest it, let it marinate, figure out what they think about these candidates based on what they said, have another bite at that apple come September for that second debate, and then decide who they want to vote on. That's the first thing. But the second side of the coin is that, we're about a little over 4 months now out from November. That's an eternity in politics. That is so much time. It may sound like not a lot of time when you talk about, because we started talking about the 2024 election the day after the 2020 election. So we've definitely gotten closer to election day, but 4 months in Washington is a lot of time.
It certainly is. And I want to talk about that debate prep because we know that both candidates have spent some time, prepping for this debate. President Biden was in Camp David this week, just in Maryland, prepping. But what has that prep looked like? And what do you think both of these candidates, when they were prepping for this debate, what were they, zeroing in on or focusing on in particular?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, President Biden was over in Camp David for a few days now, having these prep sessions with his staff. You could assume that there were some mock debates happening there, talking about these issues, trying to hone in their message. Because remember, these candidates have large platforms that they want to enforce if they become president again. Both of them, for the first time, I believe it's for the first time in history, we have a current president and a former president debating on the presidential debate stage. So they have platforms that they both want to employ in their second term in office. So they're trying to hone in that message, those big policy platforms, into a digestible soundbite, right? There's not a lot of time in this debate. There are a lot of things to get to. They want to try to be able to condense and say their policy platform in the most concise way that the American people could digest and understand and comprehend.
Right. We have a few minutes left, but I want to talk about the expectations game. It's interesting. President Trump's surrogates went on air starting Sunday and were talking pretty positively about President Biden, saying that he will rise to the occasion. He's a good debater. He's a good public speaker. That's very different from Sleepy Joe. So, talk about briefly how these candidates are playing the expectations game.
The expectations game is huge. We've seen in recent months, former President Trump question President Biden's mental acuity, say that he wouldn't be a strong debater, he can't put two sentences together. We've heard that kind of rhetoric from the former president and from his allies and from his surrogates. But recently, as you mentioned, that tone has changed with some folks saying President Biden is a skilled debater. He's done well in the past. He could very well. There's very possible that he could do well tonight. It's the expectations game. The former President Trump's campaign is trying to increase the bar, put that bar higher for President Biden, so that way if he drops any lower than that, so that way if the former president doesn't do that great in the debate, they can say, oh, well, I told you he was a great debater. If folks are saying that former President Trump won, he can say, I beat this Herculean debater. So the expectations game is in full swing right now. It's always fun to see how some things change when you're right before the debate night.
No, it certainly is. And look, we talk so much about that first 2020 presidential debate when a lot of Republicans I've talked to, and I'll probably say this later on in our coverage, but they say that was the night they believe Donald Trump lost the debate because he came in guns blazing. Some critics would say even erratic, but we've seen when President Trump, acts presidential and put together, It's very different. So we will see which version of Trump, which version of Biden show up to the podium
Very
tonight.
big questions.
A big question indeed. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Michael.
Thanks,
You're going to
Julia.
stick around. We'll be right back with more special coverage of the CNN presidential debate. I want to bring in the Hill's staff writer and White House columnist Niall Stanage, who is on the ground in Atlanta for tonight's debate. Niall, thank you so much for being here with us. It's good to see you. Just give us a sense of the mood on the ground there in Atlanta. What's the energy like?
I think the energy is typical of an occasion that's really going to be the biggest moment in the presidential campaign so far. Each candidate here has a real chance to change the trajectory of this race. Now, that is not guaranteed. Perhaps this will go in a kind of routine fashion. But there aren't that many opportunities like this to really alter the shape of the race. And I think that's what President Biden in particular is looking for tonight. So there's a lot of excitement and anticipation around that possibility.
Yeah, a lot of Democrats I've talked to have been comparing tonight possibly to his State of the Union address, saying that he could very much take this opportunity to step it up. But moving on to the question of guilty verdicts. Niall, are you expecting former President Trump and Hunter Biden's guilty verdicts to dominate much of this debate? Or do you think these two candidates are going to try to stick to the issues that impact American voters every day?
Well, what we've seen is some indication from the Biden campaign that they have become more willing to use former President Trump's conviction on those 34 felonies against him. We see that being mentioned more in their campaign communications. We see it being alluded to in some ads. But I think from Biden's perspective, he's really trying to push several ideas, not really confined to Trump's recent conviction. He's also trying to cast Trump as a danger to American democracy. He's trying to talk, we think, about reproductive rights and, of course, the overturning of Roe versus Wade. From former President Trump's perspective, I would not be surprised if he mentioned Hunter Biden. I think that's very possible that he will do. But I don't know how hard he will hammer that point, because there are a lot of other things he wants to talk about, including immigration and inflation. The last one in particular being a way that he can attack Biden, but connect that to people's real world concerns.
Yeah, I know inflation is obviously a huge issue for voters. Niall, I know you briefly caught up with Georgia Governor Brian Kemp. He obviously has a very interesting and bit of a contentious relationship with Donald Trump.
I think if the former president's looking in the rearview mirror, whether it's 2020 or any other grievances from the past or any of those kind of things, I'm not looking that way. I'm looking forward. I'm working hard every day to make people's lives better in Georgia. And I think if he resonates and says that to people, you vote for me, I'm going to make your lives better day one when I'm in the White House, and after a year in the White House, and after 4 more years in the White House, I think he's going to have a good night.
So Governor Kemp was interesting because he was saying to me in the spin room about the importance, as he sees it, of former President Trump avoiding getting caught up in the grievances of the past, in the governor's words. Now, as you say, Kemp and Trump have a very contentious relationship, basically rooted in Kemp's refusal to support Trump's attempt to overturn the 2020 election result here in Georgia. But Kemp's argument was that Trump needs to be forward-looking, that he needs to be talking about what we just mentioned, the importance of trying to change people's lives for the better. Kemp doesn't think it would be wise or prudent for Trump to talk about the 2020 election or to complain about the purported injustices of his recent trial or any of that stuff.
Right. And it's unclear whether Trump will listen to that advice from Governor Kemp, but we'll see on that one. Niall, this is the first time since 1988 that a presidential debate has not been overseen by the Commission on Presidential Debates. The CNN debate tonight, or the CNN presidential debate, has new rules. Are you expecting anything new from these rules or potentially any hiccups in the road?
I think the big question that everyone has is how this idea of muting the microphone of the candidate who's not speaking it goes. Obviously, back in 2020, former President Trump and President Biden had an extremely rowdy, somewhat chaotic debate. The idea of the muted microphones is a way to try to avoid that. Will that work? I mean, these two lecterns are only about 8 or 12 feet apart. It's pretty close. You could still imagine one candidate's comments being picked up on the other's microphone. But this will be an attempt to instill some sort of order. The other point, Julia, which I don't think we want to overlook, is there's no audience in the room. That is unusual. That will change the atmosphere, change the dynamics around the debate. I don't know if it will advantage one candidate or the other, but it'll be interesting to see how it lands in that environment.
Right. And, for Trump, we talk so much about how he feeds off of the audience, but we forget Trump is a TV person. So he's used to being in these environments. Before I let you go, you brought up that very infamous first 2020 presidential debate. A lot of Republicans I've spoken to have said they believe Donald Trump lost the 2020 presidential election because of his behavior and his demeanor during that debate. Which version of Trump are we going to get tonight?
Predicting Donald Trump's behaviours always seems to me a bit of a fool's errand. There is some suggestion that he's going to be a little more restrained. If I were a betting man, I would not be putting a lot of money on that. At the end of the day, Julia, Donald Trump is Donald Trump. And that is who he is. Some people love it, some people hate it. I'm not sure you're going to get some radically transformed version of Donald Trump at tonight's debate. And the 2020 debate, yes, it was certainly important. Yes, it was certainly contentious. I'm not wholly persuaded that that was the decisive issue in the election. I mean, that was an election that was held in the midst of the COVID pandemic. Then President Trump's handling of that pandemic was widely criticised. I think that was an exponentially greater factor than his behaviour at that first rowdy debate.
There was a lot going on in the year of 2020, so easy to forget everything that happened around the time of the debate. But Niall, as always, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk right after the CNN presidential debate wraps up tonight. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
We caught up with Rising co-host Robbie Suave earlier today. Here's a look at what he's expecting and looking out for tonight.
So the biggest thing I'll be looking forward to in the debate tonight is how Trump and Biden handle the microphone situation. This debate is going to be unlike any other in that there's no live studio audience, and the candidates are going to be prevented from interrupting each other, supposedly by the moderators with an ability to mute them. The problem is, obviously, Donald Trump wants to get after Biden as much as possible, wants to cut in, wants to call him Sleepy Joe, wants to impugn his energy level, and our understanding is that's going to be prevented. So at that point, does it become almost two separate debates, with Joe Biden answering questions from Dana Bash, Jake Tapper on one front, and then Trump answering a totally different set of questions, and it's like CNN versus Biden and CNN versus Trump. I think that might end up being a little bit unsatisfying to voters watching, but we'll have to see how it's done. On specific policy questions, it's going to be key for Trump to explain what has gone wrong with immigration and what he would do differently. This is the top complaint of Americans right now. It's the number one issue, and it's one Trump's leading by. I'm also interested to see whether Trump says anything about what's going on in the Middle East. Israel, Gaza is a major sore spot for Joe Biden, a weak spot, something that's really alienated parts of his base. Trump could theoretically pick up young voters, Arab American voters, if he signals that he would do something differently. So he's not been very specific on that aspect of policy lately. It will be interesting if CNN presses him to give some specific answers on what his policy differences would be. Biden just has to convince Americans that he can actually make it for 4 more years, answer those questions about age. That's going to be a tough ask given what we've seen from Biden lately, but we'll find out tonight.
Tune into Rising on the Hill's YouTube page tomorrow for their full reaction. And we'll be right back with more special coverage of the CNN presidential debate. And welcome back to America's Vote 2024, special coverage of the CNN presidential debate. I want to bring in Scott Traner, the Director of Data Science for Decision Desk HQ. Scott, it's always great to see you. I want to look at Decision Desk's forecasting tool. As of today, what does it show when it comes to President Biden and former President Trump's chances of winning the election?
Well, we just updated it about 45 minutes ago. It upticked a little bit, 58% chance for Donald Trump, which, interestingly enough, Julia, when we were talking a month ago, right after the verdict, the conviction of Donald Trump, it was right there, 58%. So not a whole lot of movement after that. And we'll see if this debate gets any movement.
Right. And it's interesting. There was a New York Times Siena College poll released earlier today that showed Trump with a 4-point lead. So we'll be certainly watching for those post-debate bumps, if you will. So I want to go on to a different poll. A new CBS YouGov poll shows President Biden has a nearly 25-point lead over Trump among voters that are under 30. But a Fox News poll released earlier this month shows Biden up 15 points over Trump among voters 65 years and older. Scott, there's clearly a generational, divide here, but it seems like Biden is leading with both of these groups. But at the end of the day, we know that older voters, senior citizen voters, tend to be more reliable when it comes to getting them out to the polls. So which group is slated to have more of an impact here?
Well, Deb, the numbers are pretty clear. If you're 55 and older, you vote at a higher rate. And let's just be honest, there are more registered voters 55 and older. So that's the segment that you would want to win. Now, those younger voters, they're going to play a factor on the margins. And look, states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, those races are going to be determined, or those states are going to be determined by a couple of points on the margin. So yes, by and large, 55 plus, 65 plus voters, they make up a large, more reliable voting bloc. But the under 30 crowd, they're gonna make up a small but vocal minority that could tip the balance in some of these states.
Earlier today, for the first time really this cycle, the Democratic National Committee hit Donald Trump directly over his Georgia election fraud case. It marked the first time the committee has really directly attacked him. They put this all on a mobile billboard outside of the debate site in Atlanta. But, when it comes to this issue, a new poll by AP NORC shows that overall 48% approve of his conviction. Will this be enough for Biden's 2024 chances, or do Democrats need to be careful about this? Because when looking at this issue, Scott, you think obviously it's historic. He's the first president to be convicted of a felony or a crime. But at the same time, this isn't something that impacts voters on a day-to-day basis, is it not?
Yeah, it's not something that impacts them. And look, by and large, we've seen this post-conviction, right? Post-conviction, which again, the Georgia case hasn't been litigated yet. We don't have anything out of there, but at least the Manhattan court case, we haven't seen a whole lot of movement because a lot of the voters have made up their minds. Now, is there potential for movement on some of these things? Possibly, but by and large, the public has determined whether or not they think Donald Trump deserves any sort of punishment at the polls for some of these things. Now, one thing I'd like to point out too is 48%. It's interesting to me if we were to poll the average, verdict, if someone gets convicted in a local crime or something like that, we would see those numbers 70, 80, 90% approved. So the fact that it's at 48% tells me that this is a polarizing issue and not a whole lot of people are going to change their mind between now and the end.
Well, and it's a risk for President Biden to go after Trump on this issue because we know that the president's son, Hunter Biden, was also convicted of several felonies. How is President Biden, or is President Biden even being affected by this in the polls? Unlike President Trump, he is a step removed from this.
Yeah, we don't really see it affecting the polls. It certainly has eaten up a bunch of news cycles. If we believe the news reports, it's certainly been a strain on his family, and it probably is not something they want to be dealing with. The Donald Trump campaign and Donald Trump himself have been pushing it as a way to characterize and paint them as corrupt and criminal. It'll be interesting to see how they treat this tonight at the debate, because it is going to come up. Donald Trump making statements about potentially pardoning some of these Jan 6 protesters and all those types of things. And there's been talk by some Donald Trump advisors that Donald Trump might try and steal the show and say, look, I'm going to go ahead, if I'm president, I'm going to go ahead and pardon Hunter Biden. Look for a lot of fireworks in and around that, but this is an issue that Joe Biden does not want to talk about, but not necessarily something that's hurting him at the polls either.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how both of them approach the idea of a guilty conviction. I didn't think we'd be talking about this during an election year, but here we are. Speaking of elections, finally, I want to go back to the presidential map and talk about Biden and Trump's respective paths to victory. I think it's interesting because Georgia played a major role in Biden's path to victory in 2020, but it seems to be a bit more of a difficult state for him this time around. Talk about their respective paths.
Yeah, look, Joe Biden's path runs through Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. He won Georgia in 2020, but that's not a state he needs to get to 270. It's a state he'd like. It's a state he'd like to compete in. But, fundamentally and historically, that has been a Republican state. And right now, we're sitting at about a 65% chance that Donald Trump wins that again. So that's not necessarily out of reach, but it's certainly not what it was in 2020. Joe Biden's path really is going to be Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. These are the states he needs if he's going to be get his second term.
Well, Scott Traner, thank you so much for joining us. And I think you're going to be joining us later on, so we'll see you soon.
Yeah, see you after the debate.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us here on America's Vote 2024 special coverage of the CNN presidential debate. Make sure to come back here right after the debate.